Thank you all for coming to this, which I think is the second installment of the Misinformation Speaker Series for 2025-26. This series, for those of you that haven't been attending our events, is co-sponsored between Northeastern University and Harvard University at the Shorenstein Center. My sort of partners in this, who I don't see in the room, are Brian E. Swire Thompson and David Lazar at Northeastern. Maybe they're on the Zoom feed today. Before I introduce today's speaker, just want to let you know that we do have two more speakers this term. On November 20th, we have Matt Mata from Boston University, and on December 5th, we have Ben Lyons from the University of Utah. Both of these are at the Kennedy School here at Harvard. And then we will have another set of speakers in the spring. At the last event, David, my partner in this, turned to me and said, "How long have we been doing this?" And I said 5 or 6 years because I didn't really remember. But I went back and looked. It turns out our first series was in 2017. So it's been longer than we thought. Anyway, today we're fortunate to have John Wybie with us. He is an associate professor at Northeastern University. He is also faculty co-director of the Institute for Information, the Internet, and Democracy, and director of the AI Media Strategies Lab. He's the author of The Social Fact and most recently, Governing Babel, the debate over social media platforms and free speech and what comes next. John has worked in the news media. He's served as a consultant to technology companies, foundations, and government. And today he's here to talk to us about regulating social media, America's global communications dilemma. So please join me in welcoming John Wybie.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate it. It's a real treat to be actually back at Shorenstein. I worked here a number of years ago before I became an assistant professor, and have really fond memories, and in some ways feel like my career kind of came out of working at Shorenstein. So, and Matt was instrumental in helping to mentor me, as well as Tom Patterson and a whole bunch of other folks. I'm just going to say a couple things about what we're calling the Triple ID, which is the institute that Matt mentioned. This institute is brand new at Northeastern. We haven't even formally had a launch, but we're really hoping to do great empirical work on social and behavioral dimensions of online platforms, and to make a contribution, we hope, also across cultures and societies. So actually next week, we're going to have a big meeting with some European researchers about how to study the internet in greater depth. And so, stay tuned. We should have a lot more. But for those of you interested in the sort of global dimensions of tech policy and internet policy, we hope to become a locus and a good partner with Shorenstein. Okay, so here we are in 2025. As the United States sort of stands on its heels in terms of tech policy and internet regulation. And it does seem like the winter of our discontent in terms of public policy and rulemaking of any kind around these sort of issues, particularly in the United States. And I don't want to sound like Pollyanna here. I was just out at the Stanford Trust and Safety Research Conference, which is an annual conference, and people were pretty down because it was a community that really had worked pretty closely with regulators and government and the companies, and now there's a big pullback. And so I want to be totally honest about that, even as I propose some ideas that would, I think, hopefully bring about some pro-social change. Okay, so we look across the pond, as it were, to the UK and to the EU, and we see the Online Safety Act, we see the Digital Services Act, we see the Digital Markets Act. We look to countries like Brazil and India, which are kind of going their own directions, Australia, Kenya. There's so many different models out there. And of course, China's sort of cyber sovereignty model is another model that exists out there in the world. So we hear talk of America's sort of old Section 230 rules, so-called Magna Carta of the internet. being replaced by Europe's new constitution in digital space. And as I said, India and Brazil are kind of going their own directions now with a whole bunch of new rules being stood up. And as we look out at not just China, but also Iran and Russia, we see them, increasingly vigilant about policing their cyber borders with a kind of neo-feudal zeal. Today, I'm going to talk about the kind of the core argument in this new book that's out, just out from MIT Press. It's a trade book, so it attempts to do a lot of translational work. It is in some ways a work that stands on the shoulders of lots of giants, including some in this audience today. Like David Lazar, who's my partner in crime on the new institute, along with Laura Edelson and Rebecca Tromble. And so it builds on a lot of empirical research, a lot of computational social science. But I think my strong suit is as an explanatory writer and author here. And so what I try to do is do a lot of storytelling and narrative nonfiction. There's also a normative argument embedded in it, and I've done a bunch of empirical work through surveys, cross-national surveys, and so I sort of pipe that all in and try to make it all come together, and it tries to land an argument by the end. So here we are. I mean, you see on the left here the sort of the Europeans, Thierry Breton and Margrethe Vestager. Over on the right, that's kind of an old picture, but you see Prime Minister Modi with Mark Zuckerberg. There is this huge debate about power and platforms across the world. And it is a contentious debate. It is largely slipping out of the hands of the United States to control where that debate is going, even as we've seen, some jawboning of the Europeans by the Trump administration, but people are racing ahead. And so one of the arguments that I make is that we're missing a big opportunity. And to the extent that we have anything resembling kind of regulation, it seems to be these sort of episodic hearings, this kind of, theatrical spectacle that we see in Congress from time to time, where the tech CEOs show up and they don't really have to do more than just kind of bob and weave and duck and survive the day, and maybe they win and maybe they lose, but there's nothing really on the other side of that. There's no structure to this dialogue. There's no set of baselines that are being accumulated in terms of, like, what is the evidence of the harms? What is the evidence for lack of harms? So we're sort of, sitting on the sidelines. This is happening even as I think, and I think this is indisputable, but the tech platforms themselves are being weaponized across the world. Algorithms amplifying extreme perspectives and hate speech, personalization of content fragmenting the public sphere in many societies. And being hard-headed and empirical about this, there were many underlying trends. The winds of authoritarian populism, the political economy of technology, organic trends in polarization and sorting, and then cyclical backlashes against immigrants and trade. Many of these are sort of underlying forces and trends that are being then exacerbated and accelerated by the platforms. And I think that is a fact. Now, what the exact mix is, I think, is subject to debate. One of the book, in some ways, draws on some work that was done at the Shorenstein Center. I'll talk a little bit about it, but in particular, Tom Wheeler, who was the chairman of the FCC under President Obama and who was a fellow here, he and some others wrote an influential white paper a few years ago. So I draw a lot on that. And Tom was nice enough to blurb the book, but I also want to quote him. And he says of the current situation, compared with the EU, UK, and China, the United States is on the sidelines, watching while the race is on to develop national policies that will be spread internationally by the same network that created the need for the regulation in the first place. So norms and counter norms cascading across the world. An opportunity exists, but I think it's being lost. My contention here is that American leadership is key, not because of some moral superiority, but HQ for a lot of the relevant companies, whether it's Google and Meta, or increasingly OpenAI and Anthropic and the other relevant companies in the digital space, are all mostly in California. And so getting something that could put some effective rules down, I think could be very helpful. Creating a model here could create a kind of norm cascade across the world for the creation of parallel institutions at the national level. But again, it's the winter of our discontent, and so we need to be pretty realistic. Okay, so the book has 4 core chapters. One is on disinformation. The next is on hate speech and human rights. The third is on incitement, and the fourth is on AI. And there are lots of other harms, obviously, that are part of the online world that we could discuss. And I sort of exclude a whole bunch of stuff that that you may also be interested in, and just for the sake of space, I needed to kind of focus on some things. I try throughout the book to go through what I call the 100-year journey, and the 100-year journey, as I sort of scope it out, is roughly the Supreme Court decisions that came out of World War I, which first really defined the First Amendment in the United States in a meaningful way, through to the early regulation around radio, the creation of the FCC in 1934. And so I keep in the book trying to go back in history and then come forward to see if there are some actual continuities or sort of deeper values or first principles that we could kind of pipe into a new digital regulator of some kind. So you get you get a little history about how propaganda and disinformation in a kind of mass media society first came about. On the left here, we actually have some British gunners who are fighting Nazis, I think, in the Netherlands, and you may not be able to see the texture of the photo, but they're actually shooting leaflets, which is if you think about the terminology we use today about information warfare, like pretty interesting, all the way up to those who are part of the global fact-checking movement, and that's Africa Check, actually, which is doing great work on the African continent, and they're featured actually in the book. So there's lots of sort of narrative history, and one of the one of the things I try to do is trace this trajectory from early disinformation efforts, which is essentially tricking journalists. That was sort of the game, 100 years ago. To shooting leaflets, right, during conflict, to industrial grade information warfare, such as what we see in Ukraine right now, or we see in other places across the globe. And I try to go back to some of the early thinkers who first laid out principles that I think still frame. By the way, here's a early American propaganda poster, which is in the book. Kind of wonderful piece of propaganda that came out of the Creel Commission. The United States was actually one of the real innovators, actually, in society-wide propaganda 100 years ago. But I try to go back to some early thinkers, particularly the political scientists who thought about propaganda. And so this is Harold Lasswell, whose name you may know because he's framed some of the sort of core communications theories. But he also, under the political scientist Charles Merriam, wrote a dissertation that was called Propaganda Technique in the World War. And in 1927, he published this dissertation. By the way, Charles Merriam had been basically the US propaganda minister in Rome during World War I. So he sort of sent out his doctoral student to go study propaganda. And Lasswell's book, or his dissertation and book, is really the first time anyone formally lays out, like, what is disinformation and propaganda look like? By the way, disinformation is a Soviet Stalinist coinage. It was called propaganda prior. There's a lot of literature which I draw on about the differences between propaganda and disinformation and misinformation. I'm not going to get too much into the definitional debates here. But Lasswell says, to illuminate the mechanisms of propaganda is to reveal the secret springs of social action and to expose to the most searching criticism our prevailing dogmas of sovereignty, of democracy, of honesty, and of the sanctity of individual opinion. And so he takes the empirical study of disinformation and propaganda, and he brings it up to this like more philosophical level. And I think there are a lot of great ideas in there. throughout his life, he was advising administrations on how to deal with propaganda. When the Nazis were trying to spread propaganda, he was right there in their ear, suggesting different techniques. During World War II, he actually came up with something he called the the plan of instant reply. He thought that wherever the Nazis said anything, did anything, broadcast anything, put something in a leaflet or a newspaper, he thought that the United States government should find ways to instantly reply at all points. And he comes up with a whole philosophy on it. It's interesting because, during COVID, we were labeling everything, right? There was all these sort of replies in digital space, and in some ways, he kind of anticipates that in a kind of interesting way. He thought reply and counter speech were what he called deeply entrenched in the folk ways of democracy, and he thought that if we as a democratic country, we need to walk the walk, so we need to value speech, but we need to sort of oppose speech which is harmful, wherever it is rendered. He even had weird ideas, like if Mein Kampf is to be circulated in American society, that it should have like pages within Mein Kampf that would like oppose Mein Kampf. It was sort of a convoluted and probably impractical scheme, but kind of fun to think about some of these earlier attempts. So the other thing I mentioned the sort of the other big substantive chapter, the second big substantive chapter is on hate speech and human rights, and I try to remind readers, I don't know if I'm successful or not, that in some ways international human rights law was deeply intertwined with American First Amendment principles, and there's a lot of debate about whether these two are just incompatible, whether the First Amendment is a kind of maximalist libertarian doctrine. But Eleanor Roosevelt, in helping to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then subsequently the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which followed that, all of that was a deeply American project in a lot of ways. And I think we've forgotten that. And so I try to bring about that memory of the First Amendment on the global stage and what that would mean. Where are we now? And I'll get to this Pew graph in a second. Consider a representative recent period. So in the first 9 months of a recent year, 2023, Meta reported having taken down 27.6 million posts on Facebook for containing hate speech. Meanwhile, YouTube reported having shut down 10 million channels between July and September of 2023. This is fairly representative for all possible violations. And so among those 10 million were 26,000 channels that contained hate or abusive speech. YouTube removed 187,000 individual videos for containing hate speech over that period. TikTok removed 136.5 million videos in total, with about 3 million of those videos removed because they contained hateful speech. So we're seeing, hate speech and, and related sort of species of messages really at an industrial scale now and across the globe. And, in some ways, the platforms embody what the global norms are, which is a kind of peculiar situation. Many of them reference human rights law and international law in their policies, but whether they actually live it is a big question. I think they fail on it more often than not. Over on the right is just an interesting bit of polling survey work that Pew did a few years ago, which just speaks to how different cultural attitudes are, even within notionally, common regions. So this is East Asia, and the questions are essentially, people should be allowed to speak their opinions publicly, even if they upset other people, versus on the right, harmony with others is more important than the right to speak one's opinion. And we've done some work, my colleague Mio Chung is here in the audience, and we've done some work around some of these issues in terms of survey research. It tends to be that if you ask people at a very high level how to weigh the trade-offs between free speech and social stability or harmony, you get a lot of agreement, but then it's the devil's in the details. As you ask more specific questions, people start to diverge more, and even again in a a particular region, you'll see a lot of diversity of opinion. So how whether the platforms can ever aspire to a kind of universal norm is, I think, a big question. Maria Ressa, who's sort of one of the, I think, the heroes of the book, and maybe a hero to a lot of folks who care a lot about journalism. She won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2021. She said in that speech, an invisible atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem, and the world must act as it did after Hiroshima. Like that time, we need to create new institutions, like the United Nations, and new codes stating our values, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to prevent humanity from doing its worst. It's an arms race in the information ecosystem. It's a profound speech in many ways. One of the problems, and here comes to the sort of the third piece of my kind of substantive writing here. One of the problems is that so much on incitement, so many of the problems are embedded in coded incitement, right? They're embedded in dog whistles. They are embodied in memes. They represent ambiguously inciting speech. And so it is terribly difficult if you are a platform moderator sometimes to figure out exactly what the intent of the message is. And I think we should not pretend that it's going to be an easy thing to do. But I'm going to talk about in a few minutes some things that I think the platforms could do. Finally, the last sort of substantive chapter, which is on AI and what I call epistemic risk. You hear a lot of people in Silicon Valley and the effective altruism community, whatnot, talking about existential risk and the sort of sci-fi visions of killer robots being the kind of the most important thing right now. I actually think that it is more epistemic in terms of the risk right now. I think the models do a whole bunch of different things. The LLM models do a whole bunch of different things to knowledge and to information that can really distort reality. I'm happy to talk about that. But we see, in whether it's in Sora 2 or Nano Bananas or any of the recent applications that have been released by the AI companies, the potential to do a lot of mischief online. Some of it's just funny and satirical. Some of it, though, is definitely going to be used for deepfakes and synthetic media that is intended to deceive. And so I was talking with my students just 2 days ago about is it going to be the case that if we condition audiences enough on AI slop and AI content, will we actually start to lose maybe a willingness to even care, which is sort of scary, right? So we came up with this idea of a kind of post-authenticity environment. Maybe people just find it amusing. It's satirical. It's useful. We see the president using all kinds of AI to communicate messages. Maybe people aren't going to care whether it's real. And that's a super scary thought. Okay. I'm going to now get to sort of where we are in terms of public policy, and then I'll kind of finish up with a set of possible ideas that I think could be helpful. So we are, in many ways, stuck in 1996. The Section 230, which is part of the Telecommunications Act, the subset was the Communications Decency Act, as you, I think probably everyone in the room knows, basically said that online platforms, or I forget what the terminology actually is in the code, but can moderate things, but they don't have to, and they're not liable for what's posted in terms of user-generated content. So we have no tools to shape these massive new media forces. We are, in many ways, stuck right in this moment when Clinton and Gore signed the telecommunications bill, which they were very excited about. It was a moment of enthusiasm. You may remember it. There was this really heady environment around the information superhighway, and this was going to create a lot of innovation, and it did. But it also left in place a pretty archaic way of looking at the online world. And so we're 30 years on now with really nothing in place. There has been talk in Congress of sunsetting the Section 230. I don't know where that's going, but still, you know, even if you're going to sunset it, you got to figure out what comes next. And I don't think we've been there. So I just a bit of an aside. There was a recent case before the Supreme Court called NetChoice. That's the shorthand, in which there were Texas and Florida laws that were there were substantive questions about whether they could sort of mandate a kind of right to post. And the Supreme Court sided with the companies, and basically the social media companies basically said, you are effectively a kind of publisher. We're not going to exactly define that, but we're not going to make you do anything because it would violate your expressive rights to free speech under the First Amendment. And I think, many people breathe a sigh of relief because there were kind of weird laws in Texas and Florida. But, there is the question, like, what would happen if actually some really smart, intelligent laws were passed at the state level and then went up to a Supreme Court? And you may say, well, it's just a conservative Supreme Court. They're going to side with, one particular point of view. But actually, it's quite diverse if you read the opinions, particularly the concurring opinions. And I want to read you Justice Barrett's opinion because she, in some ways, is becoming the swing vote in the court. And so she sided with the companies and said, yeah, we can't force them to do anything exactly. But she said, but what if a platform's algorithm just presents automatically to each user whatever the algorithm thinks the user will like? For example, content similar to posts with which the user previously engaged. The First Amendment implications of the Florida and Texas laws might be different for that kind of algorithm. And then what about AI, which is rapidly evolving? What if a platform's owners hand the reins of an AI tool and ask it simply to remove hateful content? If the AI relies on large language models to determine what is hateful and should be removed, has a human being with First Amendment rights made an inherently expressive choice not to propound a particular point of view? So, I mean, I read her words, and I've talked with, I'm not a legal scholar, playing one on TV, I guess, today, but I've talked with a bunch of legal scholars about what this means. Like, what's Barrett thinking? Because this is pretty key. And I think she opens the door to seeing certain computationally driven actions by the social platforms as less expressive and less protected potentially. And so the implication is that perhaps algorithms that have a kind of broad infrastructural function might be regulated lawfully. So a general axiom in American law is that government can regulate conduct, but not speech. Perhaps some layers of social platform activity may ultimately be judged conduct in subsequent cases. It's difficult to say. Okay. There is, by the way, growing, little green shoots out there, growing bipartisan agreement on some genuine harms, whether that's terrorism, scams, child abuse, child sexual abuse material. And then we have the Take It Down Act, which passed, fairly recently, which had a ton of bipartisan support, which targets non-consensual intimate imagery and including synthetic versions of that type of content. So there are, there do seem to be little green shoots of like bipartisan agreement on certain types of harms, which I think may open the door to other kinds of regulation. But of course, like, again, don't mean to be naive or a Pollyanna here, right? The lobbying and the entrenched interests of oligarchs of all kinds will need to be overcome with a broad political movement if we're going to get anywhere. And so I actually think there needs to be probably a political movement, maybe embedded in a presidential campaign in subsequent years, if this is ever going to actually move. Okay, I want to talk about my ideas for reform. So again, we're on a 100-year journey here. We basically didn't have a substantive First Amendment 100 years ago. We didn't really have anything to regulate early broadcast. There was not much on the books. I want to quote the First Amendment scholar, the preeminent First Amendment scholar and the former president of Columbia University, Lee Bollinger, who says, "We have been through this before. In fact, this is more or less exactly the situation we found ourselves in with broadcasting beginning in the first half of the last century with similar concerns. Now, you may say to Professor Bollinger that the particularism of our technology means that this is not, a set of applicable analogies, but bear with me for a second. Neither the First Amendment jurisprudence that came out of the Supreme Court in the 19 teens or the 20s, or in subsequent cases, nor the communications policy rules that came out of the FCC in the 1930s were in any way inevitable. Jurists, politicians, and the public had to, in some ways, invent and accept new concepts to deal with emerging realities. Again, coming back to Bollinger, we have been through this before. The modern world presented new problems. Americans found pragmatic but creative tools. And a century ago, the country saw a kind of founding period in the speech and communications domain. So my argument is essentially that the social web era, now 100 years later, demands a similar second founding, or a new, at least a reinvention. An underlying regulatory rationale has to be created of some kind. Under the FCC leveraged the rationale that there was scarcity in the airwaves. I think there are a number of ways of creating new policy rationales. I'll talk about that in a second. But the reality is we have to be creative, and there's no reason to think that our rationale has to come from nature, right? We've done this before. We need to translate deep values and principles into our own technological moment. Okay, so here I come to what I'm calling the response principle. You can contrast that with the public interest principle, which was the foundation of the FCC in 1934. The basic idea is it requires a duty of care. And here I get this from Tom Wheeler. His book Techlash is wonderful. You should all read it. But also Gene Kimmelman and Phil Verveer were co-authors on a paper, a Shorenstein paper actually, that laid out a kind of blueprint for a digital platform agency. My view is that we're going to run into First Amendment problems very fast if there are any rules that relate to particular pieces of content or messages. That we're going to have to use more of a risk management framework, a risk assessment scheme, and it would need to be effects-based. It could not spell out exactly with some kind of pristine definitional clarity exactly what can go up and what must be taken down. I think the DSA, I think people pretty much acknowledge that Europe's rules under the Digital Services Act would violate the First Amendment. And Congress has actually gotten quite active on this, and so it's the European censorship machine, which through the Brussels effect is trying to push censorship on Americans. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but I do think it has to be much more agile than what the Europeans have adopted. You may say, well, where would this get any democratic legitimacy? And I think there are a lot of scholars out there who are playing with ideas around citizen assemblies, citizen juries, ways of actually trying to anchor public policy and rulemaking and decision making in a more democratic context. And so what I would imagine is some sort of expert agency that has both appointed commissioners, but also has, where there need to be broad judgments made about the degree to which the platforms are showing a duty of care, some kind of citizen body that could help make those calls. And I also, my colleague Laura Edelson and I have talked quite a bit about the difference between regulating big tech as a product or regulating content. She's much more on the product side. She says, they have patents on a lot of their functionality and features and algorithms, so maybe you could regulate it that way. And I think, under a new kind of digital regulator, you could imagine issues of product design, sort of upstream design being also, part of the mix of things that are considered, along with some of the privacy and data exploitation issues that I think trouble a lot of people. So again, the book isn't like it's not like a big policy brief. It's most of the cases, a lot of stories and some translational work around the social science. But it does posit that we could create a new kind of digital regulator. What would that do? Well, think about the early years of the FCC. The FCC, it was kind of a mess for many years, actually decades. What the FCC did, though, is it began to structure the dialogue. So you think about the the congressional hearings, which kind of go nowhere, right? There's nothing really on the other side of those. What if we set up a regulatory body which began with fact finding, which began with creating baselines, creating structure? It's going to be really hard to define hate speech and disinformation. I have no illusions. But maybe by putting evidence on the record and getting more structured about this, we can start to find some common agreement on what we might want to collect from the platforms. And data access to the platforms remains very difficult, very challenging. We're doing a bunch of things at Northeastern actually to try to address this. Happy to talk about that, or others in the room can. Obviously, if you're going to regulate anything, you need a sanction, right? You may have carrots, but you may need sticks. And so the best thing that I can come up with, and no idea if this would pass constitutional muster, but if we think about the platform as having speech rights itself, having expressive rights, and we think about the users having expressive rights, something that actually doesn't violate either of those things in its current form maybe could pass constitutional muster. I don't know. So what about a pause on user and advertiser growth? Imagine the citizen jury says, you know what, things are pretty out of line, kind of out of control on a bunch of different dimensions. Pause for a week, get things back under control, then come back to us. I don't know. It's an idea. I don't know if it would work. But I think content removal is not going to pass constitutional muster. But not directly violating the expressive rights of the platforms or the current users, right? I think might have a chance. And so targeting growth might be a solution. I'm going to wrap up because we're near 40 minutes. I will just say something about the title of the book, which is Governing Babel. And it's, Eric Barnow, who's a great media scholar, wrote a book in the 60s. I actually quote it in the, I quote from it in the beginning of my book, because it turns out that people who are interested in media and communications policy have for generations really been fascinated with this metaphor of the Tower of Babel. In the Renaissance, they were fascinated with the story. You may remember the story is basically that the people who that people built a tower toward God, and in expressing this kind of hubris, God smashed the tower and relegated them to speaking many languages so that they would not be able to understand one another. And the word Babel is actually from the Hebrew to confuse. People have been fascinated by this metaphor for a very long time. This is from Bruegel in 1563. Barnow wrote about it. Jonathan Haidt has written about it in The Atlantic. It seems to keep recurring and circulating in our minds as we try to think about media and communications and rules and trying to come to some sanity, because this biblical story just seems to recur. I'm just going to read a bit of the sort of end of the book, and then we can do questions. And by the way, on the metaphor, 7 major media platforms now, YouTube, Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, WeChat, and TikTok, have more than 1 billion active users. So we are, so to speak, building technological towers. And that's my little riff, which I'll say in the book. Book's closing words: there can be no final steady state answer for the problems created by social platforms and information communications technologies. Problems of public communication and speech take place in complex adaptive systems. They are akin to the problems of public health, terrorism, or global finance. They are problems to be managed, not solved. But I do believe we need to establish a North Star principle of response to harms by platform companies enforced under law, and to begin to develop constantly updated regulatory rules under the careful supervision of the courts. Perhaps new rules will provide a model and standard that can attract allies, preserving important aspects of innovation culture and the First Amendment, while also acknowledging the increasing power of networked communications technologies to inflict harm and fuel undemocratic energies and forces. Or perhaps inertia will prevail, leaving Babel's current state of confusion and growing clouds of moral and political darkness to continue spreading across the globe. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you. Such a great topic. I have so many questions, but I'll just start with one and then I'll come back. I've been just wondering about, I believe that social media is qualitatively different from anything that existed at the time the First Amendment was written. And so I wonder if this argument has been made that it doesn't resemble speech, it doesn't resemble assembly or the press because of its instantaneous nature and because of its global reach. It's a totally different thing and maybe shouldn't be governed by that amendment. Has anybody looked into this or proposed that?
It's a terrific question, and I wish I had a strong answer. I know people people have theorized about, for example, like what is microblogging. I remember there's a debate about Twitter. Is Twitter people actually speaking or is it writing? Is it, there seems to be this ambiguous membrane between lots of the forms of speech that we see online and actual speech that we would recognize as human speech. And so I think you're totally right. Maybe this is something just qualitatively different and would need to be regulated in an entirely different way. But I would hope that we could analogize, because my argument is that nothing came out of nature that told the justices of the 19 teens and 20s that the First Amendment needed to be interpreted in these particular ways. They came up with what they thought was logical, and they've tried to over the years. But this is in many ways, I think, a creative act. And the same with the FCC. Was radio perfectly analogous to human speech in a public square where people are? I don't know. And I suspect people said the same thing about television too, that it in some ways escapes the categories that were under consideration in the 1780s and 90s. But it's a wonderful question. I don't know if you want to follow up. Yeah.
I guess I don't know where to go with that one, but the other question I had was around your idea of effects-based regulation.
Yep.
It feels like what's the path toward? I mean, is there even agreement on the harm that, like, what disinformation is? That seems highly contentious.
Yeah.
And whether it causes harm,
Yep.
if there is, if it has been identified, is there consensus on that?
I don't think so. And I think part of what we need to do is structure the dialogue so that we might actually arrive at maybe some minimum viable definitions around public health, around elections, around other sort of core sensitive categories of human life and political life. Maybe financial areas as well, like scams and fraud and whatnot. But I just think we're very far from like rulemaking proper. And I know there's lots of, obviously the Supreme Court with Chevron and whatnot has thrown lots of sort of sand in the gears, even around rulemaking and agencies. But I do, I think aspirationally we could imagine a few years of just really gathering a lot of evidence in a structured way under the aegis of an actual regulatory body, a new digital regulator. But I think it's going to be really hard. And the thing that we can do, though, is to try to trace the causality of like large disinformation campaigns and real world harms. And I think, there's a lot of scholarship that actually shows that there are strong connections and the causality is there. I mean, maybe it doesn't explain all the variants, but it's like a good chunk of it. And deception around elections, I think in particular, you think of like Romania or Slovakia or actually there was a robocall campaign in New Hampshire, right, which faked President Biden's voice. I mean, especially where it's like very proximate to voting day or voting time, you can imagine pretty much establishing causality of like, diminished voter turnout or something else that could be at least a first step towards regulation. But those are terrific questions. I wish I had better answers. Yeah.
So your presentation tells us a lot about, how to think about these questions from the perspective of law and public policy. But what, at least in your discussion of it, what seemed to me to be kind of missing is the politics of this.
Mhm.
The FCC you described, for instance, I would say doesn't exist anymore. So this is fiction.
True.
There is no regulatory body. There is no regulatory will. In fact, the harms and things you want to prevent are seen as political benefits by a sizable portion of the folks in power. So how do we think about this outside of politics? And, it just feels very 2024, I guess.
It does. It does. Yeah. And I wouldn't, again, I don't want to sound naive, but one of the arguments of the book is that politics are and public policy is often has these sort of cyclical patterns to it. And you don't think so?
I don't think that's
For what's going on today. Yeah, I mean, it could be you're right, and this is the end of the democracy. But I mean, notionally, there will be a 2028.
John,
Yeah.
the inference is not this is the end.
Right.
The inference is there's another dimension that one has to think about in order to try and, work through this maze
That's right.
that you
That's right.
can't get from here to there without it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think electoral politics are key, right? I think I mean, just again, Pollyanna. In 2028, let's say someone ran on, among other things, a new digital regulator, which, a campaign said something like, you know what, all of you parents who are sick of like your sons becoming incels and your daughters having terrible body issues and all of the fighting and polarization that you see online, we're going to create something that's going to address that. I think that polls really well. And in fact, we know that. I have friends who have that polling data. Could somebody run on that? Could they, in part, win on that? Right? Possibly. And I know, Matt, I'm with you. Yeah. Maybe I wrote this in 2023 and 24, and that's reflected kind of in the naive optimism or in my tone. But I hope there's still the possibility.
Thank you, John. Very interesting presentation. I was particularly intrigued, from business standpoint, by your potential solution by targeting growth in number of users, growth in advertising dollars. So I wonder if there's a potential to combine some policy action with marketing solution. So essentially, for example, if for publicly traded social media platforms, they have to disclose the advertising sources, right? We've seen some of this kind of work, when a lot of big brands pulled out of Twitter, X, right? We've seen on the user side, right, the whole Disney Kimmel debate where a lot of consumers reacted very fast with dropping the subscriptions, and that was, of course, major factor in bringing them back. So I wonder sort of if that could be one of the mechanisms where basically because of the public reaction, the advertising dollars may potentially dry up in response to some of this misinformation.
Yeah, it's a great idea, Yakov. In fact, there was a bill called DSOSA. Anna Lenhart, who's a friend of mine and a policy thinker, and worked on some of that legislation. Basically, that legislation tried to bring the FTC and the advertising into the equation, so that if there were potential bad things going on with the platforms, there would be consequences on the ad side. The idea of ad boycotts has been, it seems to have been effective, though it's gotten quite controversial, and Elon's gone after people for having a ad boycott. So it's complicated, but clearly a market-based solution would be better than trying to put, black letter law down and like have a constitutional fight about that. Did you have an idea for a mechanism that would trigger people voting with their feet? Or
I mean, right now, sort of, it's still not publicly required to get disclosed what advertisers companies work with.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, if the company is not publicly traded, that's maybe even not possible legally.
Yeah.
But if the company is publicly traded, that some regulation may potentially require certain disclosures. and then some bodies, citizen bodies, can make this information very public.
Yeah.
Look, the company that you buy from is advertising on this platform that does X.
Yeah, yeah,
Essentially.
yeah. I mean, informational solutions and market-based solutions are going to be much more likely to survive, challenge. So I think that's terrific. It's a great idea.
Great. Thanks, John. That was a good Pollyannish anecdote. I think that we all need another way to think about this. But actually, building on the previous question around kind of the viability, as information scholars thinking about these ideas, thinking about policies, and the limited amount of time and effectiveness right now in this country, you opened up talking about kind of more globally, right? And would it make sense, or in terms of then ending on a US focus, what do you think about focusing on, I'm coming from the EU, so I think a lot about these EU policies, and it can have a ripple effect in the US, right? If we look at the GDPR and people being able to request their data, even outside countries that have passed these laws, that, what is the most strategic right now?
It's it's a really complex and varied landscape out there, and how these different policy regimes interact with each other, I think, is completely fascinating and probably unpredictable. The reason I started globally and then kind of came back to the United States is because of this issue that, like, a lot of the relevant companies are headquartered here. And I do think there's a whole tier of countries such as Brazil and India, many in Africa, some in East Asia, that are sort of looking for what would be a potential solution. And I do think if the United States set something up that was a kind of minimum viable policy solution through a regulatory body, you can imagine others saying, we're going to do the same. And that having a kind of validity that the companies, which frankly have outsized power in all of these, especially the developing world, in those markets, they would have to respect that. And we also see a ton of job owning. We see a ton of sort of extra legal action against the companies to take things down, to suppress dissidents and whatnot. So I think an American model could strengthen. I think civil society across the world. Maybe again, I'm naive. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but I think what the EU and the EC are doing is super innovative and super interesting. I'm not sure it's going to work exactly, but because it's quite complex. But I think it's forcing, in some ways, it forced me to sort of rethink, well, what would be, what's possible, and how could the United States respond with its own kind of DSA? What would be First Amendment respecting? And the rubber hits the road in platform policy, and then their operationalization of, like, whatever community standards or terms of service they have. So the companies hold the cards in a lot of ways as well.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm from Germany, so it's very interesting for me to hear your perspective on the European regulation. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe make it more concrete. What kind of patterns of harm could trigger a regulation from your idea, or how to enforce a duty of care?
Yeah.
Like, maybe I was thinking of this example of the assassination of Brian Thompson, the United
Yeah.
Healthcare
Yeah.
CEO, and how people were celebrating his murder afterwards online or in social media platforms. And in Europe or in Germany, the platforms would be obliged to take this down with the argument of a duty of care and to prevent people
Yeah.
imitating such crimes. So isn't that kind of the same idea? And I still don't see how this cannot be regulated even with the First Amendment rights. Or maybe you could give us an idea how this would work in practice.
Yeah, and I mean, the hate speech, for the most part, unless it constitutes fighting words, which is its own kind of subcategory, is constitutional under the First Amendment, under current jurisprudence of the United States. I mean, hate speech is not something that we have traditionally required people to not do or to take down. And the Germans obviously were in the lead with NetzDG, and so in some ways they've inspired all of this. So kudos to having a big idea and then trying to implement it. And I know it's not easy to implement it because yeah, and there's a lot of coded messaging and things that it becomes very difficult to define. Let me just give one example of something that I think could help trigger regulation in a positive way. So one of the things that came out of the January 6th investigations was that when people were attacking the Capitol and sort of live streaming, like, hey, go into this room and smash this, and they were live streaming and directing people through that live stream a domestic terrorist attack. And what came out from briefings and interviews with the people who are in charge of Twitter is that they were essentially they were outgunned. They did not have enough staff. They didn't have technical facility. They were sort of chasing people across the platform. They couldn't really get the whole situation under control. And so I would say, what about a preparation standard, right? What about having sufficient humans and sufficient digital and algorithmic tools to be able to address something in the case of a civil conflict or a terrorist act or something that is just like totally getting out of control? And having that having that preparation standard and overseeing the quality of it might actually be a basis for requiring a bunch of other things from the platforms. I don't know, but it just struck me that in that moment, they basically were like firefighters without hoses or hydrants. And that seems to me not a great thing for a whole variety of reasons. And we've seen other situations around the world, whether it's Myanmar or Kenya or other places, where the platforms, because they didn't have the language capacity, they didn't have the will, they didn't have the people, they didn't necessarily have the technical tools. It's not as easy actually to chase things down in platforms as you think. Things got completely out of control. And I think maybe almost as you'd regulate a product, maybe that's a standard that you could enforce. Now, whether we can define disinformation and hate speech sufficiently, I don't know. But I think if we could put enough examples on the record, we could begin to maybe have some conversations and to put some pressure. And then I think with time, maybe start to get some rules about broad patterns of harm. Probably individual messages and that kind of thing are not, again, it's not gonna, I can't imagine a digital regulator being able to action on that stuff. But I do think maybe there are broad patterns and maybe we could judge them on these broad patterns.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk, and I especially appreciate your last answer there, the idea of a situation room for platforms. I hadn't heard that before. That's really neat. Just to go back to Matt's question slightly, your new digital regulator, what concrete advice would you give the new digital regulator to avoid the fate of the Disinformation Governance Board?
Yeah, and that's again these sort of elephants in the room, right? I think, look, for many generations, there's been a kind of laissez-faire free speech consensus in the United States. So the civil libertarians, right, which would support the Nazis marching through Skokie, or the free speech maximalists on the right, these have been like very firm positions. And we've started to see shifts. There've been a bunch of legal scholars that have written about this. The sort of, the right and the left have started to evolve on a bunch of different positions. You actually saw this around the Charlie Kirk assassination, where a bunch of people on the conservative right were like, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't endlessly autoplay Charlie's, gruesome, terrible death to people all across social media. And there was a big conversation about like, what are the appropriate things? I wonder if there could be some kind of bipartisan, again, Matt's like just groaning and rolling his eyes about bipartisanship and the possibility of new rulemaking. But no, Matt is a mentor and a friend, and I always value your insights and skepticism. But I think it would have to be done really carefully. It would have to be done in a bipartisan way. Some of the things that you mentioned were sort of done by a particular administration with a particular ideological point of view, and I think that's probably that was probably maybe a fatal flaw there, independent of like whether it should have been done that way objectively. I just think if you think about the Telecommunications Act in '96, you think about the Take It Down Act that just passed, these were supported massively in a bipartisan way. And I think that's the only way that it's going to survive moving forward. I don't know if that is satisfactory, but I think we need to go for like little wins, like very, and so, whether it's a preparation standard around, kinetic conflict or Take It Down or other kinds of, CSAM, I think all of these sort of start to get us moving in a direction. And then there might be some additional wins in the context of a structured regulatory environment. But I don't know.
Thank you for this thought-provoking talk. I have a question, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but about your sanctions solution. Is there a way to prevent platforms from sort of doing, I guess, following the YouTube style of sort of baby-proofing their platform? And so like, for example, YouTube, after like the COPPA regulations, they kind of like they don't monetize a lot of the content on the platform anymore because so many things violate their policies now. So I'm wondering if this kind of tribunal would lead to like increased content censorship on the platforms to avoid having the negative consequences of sanctions or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the huge dangers of everything I'm proposing is that they would I think the industry term would be like overaction, right? Which is to essentially self-censor to such a degree that we're actually harming free expression and free speech. I think that is a huge issue. I think it's something though that could be measured. Certainly one of the critiques of the fairness doctrine, for example, with the broadcast regulators was that you didn't see diverse points of view on TV. You didn't hear diverse points of view on radio because the station managers were self-censoring. It is a risk. At the same time, some of the people who are running broadcasts during the kind of heyday of the fairness doctrine said, you know what, there really weren't a lot of penalties. It wasn't like they were cracking down on us, but it embodied what Fred Friendly called the spirit of responsible broadcasting. And maybe putting a little angel on the shoulders of the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world wouldn't be such a bad thing. I don't know, but it's a real danger, but I think it's something that could be monitored. Oh, David has a question.
If you're willing to stay, that's great. But I think we should technically, formally draw this to a close and thank John Wybie one more time.